I'm going to make a bold prediction. Sometime in the next 12 months, something is going to happen in your life that is, best case scenario, going to get you off schedule for a bit in your goals and possibly cause you to think or rethink everything to change your goals. You're going to have to do what's called pivoting. Let's talk about when to pivot and how to pivot next. Hello and welcome to the Musician Toolkit, episode number 99. My name is David Lane, and it is great to be with you once again. So believe it or not, we have almost made it to episode 100, and that is going to be next week, and I look forward to celebrating the podcast up to this point, and then also talking to you about some differences that are going to be in the podcast going forward. And in other words, I'm going to be talking about how I'm going to be doing some pivoting with the podcast. So I thought, what better time on episode 99 to talk about pivoting? Because while, yes, I'm going to be talking about it specifically regarding the podcast, this is something that if you are in any field long enough, but especially if you're a musician, you are probably doing it quite a bit. Now, maybe you work for a school, and you've had nothing but stability, or you work for a certain church, maybe as a full-time position, and, you've found that your income is adequate, and maybe you have tenure. So maybe you have had year after year, or even multiple decades of just stability, continuity, and so maybe you have avoided having to pivot, but I think most of you, and even some of you in those long-term positions, have had to pivot every now and then. If you are mostly self-employed like myself, pivoting is kind of just like waiting for the leaves to fall in autumn. It's just something that's going to happen, but you don't know when, and you don't know to what degree. So today we're going to talk about when to pivot. What are the situations that often come up that require you to make a change in your life? And I'm going to try to be as specific as I can to musicians. I'll try to give some specific examples. So I started thinking about this episode all the way back in July. I don't know how many of you use Threads. I'm on there at David Lane Music, and I post every now and then. I haven't really gotten into it the way maybe I have at times with some other social media. But it's a very interesting app. It's like if you do anything with self-promotion at all, I get almost no feedback. Like almost anything I post regarding the podcast, the Threads, I have basically like one friend who's on Threads a lot and is kind enough to hit the heart button and sometimes reshare it. But almost nobody who isn't already following me sees any of those posts. But if you have something general to say, sometimes it does get a lot of engagement. And if you have anything that touches a nerve that might be even slightly controversial, you'll get a lot of engagement. So I had a post that touched a nerve back on July 20th. And the post was this. It was a thread. It was a two-post thread. And altogether, this is what I said. I said, "It saddens me to see musicians thinking about giving up rather than reconsidering their 20th century business model." And I added to that, musician mistakes that are not necessarily limited to this century, but really cause problems in 2024. 1, thinking that the quality of your music is the only distinguishing factor you need. 2, complaining about or criticizing other musicians. 3, failing to consider that how you present yourself as a person is at least as important as how good you are on stage. July was a while ago, so I'll try to kind of get back into where my mind was at the time and define the context and maybe unpack this pair of threads before I get into the responses that I got. So I have a someone that I follow on my personal Facebook page, and to be honest, he's a friend because he's a Facebook friend, but we're not friends in real life. It's just we've worked together before, and we have a connection. But he is a musician, and he's a rock musician. He very often wants to compare how much more deserving he and his band are of success for reasons like, they don't use autotune, and that's, a lot of bands will say that. But also he'll bring up things like, we do covers, but we don't use iPads, we don't use music stands, everything is memorized. And that's all very good, but it's presented in such a way to throw a lot of shade to the bands that are using iPads, that are using, music stands. Kind of without thinking, it's like what you're saying when you take to social media to say something like that. You're not addressing an audience saying, well, look at that band. They don't even have their stuff memorized. You're addressing kind of an imaginary issue with the audience. Obviously, if this band keeps getting hired, all these bands apparently that keep getting hired that are using, lead sheets of some kind while they're doing their music, obviously the audience is not having a problem, but you're feeling jealous that you're not getting the benefit of doing this one extra thing, which, kudos for you for doing this one extra thing. But this is why when you're deciding what to do, if it's for a business reason, you have to measure the metrics of what actually makes a difference, because not everything you can measure really, truly makes a difference. Like for this podcast, for example, I'm sure that I could really improve the overall sound. Now, I suspect that because I'm recording on an actual dynamic vocal microphone and not, for example, a laptop webcam microphone, something that's really tinny, I'm sure that makes a difference. But would it make a big difference if I did like professional quality compression and EQ and all of that? Things that I don't really do on this. I put a little bit of compression on this so that you don't get a lot of distortion, and so that you don't have to turn your volume up and down depending on how loud I'm speaking. So I do some of that, but I don't do a whole lot of that. I have a feeling what really makes a difference are things like the title, the description, and also the content itself, and making sure that what I have is something that you as a listener want to hear. So those are the things that are important. Things like audio post-production on a podcast has diminishing returns at some point. It's kind of like memorizing your music instead of using a lead sheet. If you're a cover band and your goal is to just be a good local to regional cover band, again, diminishing returns. How well you play it, yeah, that certainly matters. And if you're going to go to social media to say that you play better than everyone else, well, that makes you look not very professional. So that was that second point that I'd made, complaining or criticizing other musicians. But also thinking that the quality of your music is the only distinguishing factor that you need. There's a lot of people out there, and this has been the case for a very long time. It's just we've shifted from what labels are willing to sign. And again, a lot of you are classical musicians, so this conversation may not make a whole lot of sense. But for those of you who are in genre music, rock, pop, anything else, you're in a world where decades ago, and for a very long time before that, it was up to you to get discovered and signed by a label. And recording your music and selling your albums, your your LP vinyl albums and later your cassettes and then your CDs and so forth. That was the biggest thing that you could do, and then you would go on tour to mainly sell the albums. This is what I was referring to as a 20th century business model. And then talking about, failing to consider how you present yourself as a person is at least as important as how good you are on stage. Well, that's the same thing. The same person would make videos kind of criticizing venues for not paying enough and not at all kind about it. So I didn't want to call this person out. I definitely didn't want to call him out by name. I'm not going to call him out by name now, but I didn't want to give all of these specific examples. So I wrote what I wrote because it is a general thing. I've heard musicians get frustrated for all kinds of reasons that seem to be out of touch with the reality of trying to make a living as a musician in 2024. So, just as an example, you're going to have a very hard time making a lot of money from selling your music in 2024. But if you put your energy into developing and promoting a really good live show, you can sell high dollar tickets to that show, and then you can sell merchandise at that show, and you can make money. It does take a lot of work, and it does take thinking beyond just serving your local area, if that's something you want to do. Okay, well, I'm not even sure. It says 28 comments, but I think that's 28 comment threads. There was a lot of response to this particular one, and maybe 5% of it was positive and affirming, and 95% of it was basically people that if I had been more detailed are taking the side of this other musician. And it showed me that I really didn't understand how a lot of people were feeling about this. Now, again, I don't think I have a whole lot of traditional rock musicians listening to this podcast. But in case I do, and in case that, me reading and talking about this pair of threads caused a nerve to be hit, I'm going to go over just, a few things in detail. But the whole point that I want to make is that you need to make decisions based on the reality of the way things are now. And you need to understand that reality may not be the same in 2025. Nobody understands this better than content creators who will always tell you need to post to Instagram right now, and you need to make sure that you use these types of hashtags, and that your video is of this certain length. And it won't take but a month or two before it says, stop using hashtags and change your videos to this length. And oh, by the way, stop using so many videos. Let's go back to just carousels or photos. And then you'll have people say, Instagram's really not the right place to post right now. You should do LinkedIn. And it could get to the point to where you just say, you know what? I don't think I want to bother with this game. So again, I'm not getting into detail into the comments of the thread. I did reply to a few of them, but here are a few of just the comments, just kind of random order. The focus on the business is the biggest problem. Skill sells itself. Well, I didn't respond to that, but that's just completely untrue, and that always has been untrue. A lot of people have skill. It does not sell itself. If you want to be a professional musician, you have to think of yourself as a business. This comment is made by people who have not put in the work and not actually talked to other people who have put in the work. I know I talked about how, you've got to, you have to use social media, and I got a lot of comments on that. Maybe musicians shouldn't have to be social media managers in order to be considered viable musicians. Another comment, artists want to be artists. They don't want to be influencers. Influencer is a full-time job that doesn't require you to be an artist. If models can do it without making music, then the music is coming from doing something other than music. So it's no different to working a side job or a day job and doing music on the side, since in both scenarios, you're not being paid to create and record music. Here's some other comments that I got. Sounds like you're blaming people for being born in a certain time period. Not a fair comparison. Time changed, yes, so did the music. It doesn't help someone who is clearly not that age try shoehorn mixed ideals in a younger demographic. Here's a comment. What are they giving up exactly? Do they really put down their instrument, never to play again? Or are they walking away from part of being a musician that drains their life force? If so, I'm happy for them. Someone said, I think what you're referring to isn't about music, but rather about content. And someone said, victim blaming. So then there's this comment. So, streaming pays next to nothing, but it's completely obliterated traditional album sales. So you can't make money selling your music. And radio play is determined by media conglomerates, so the only way onto radio rotation is to be a priority artist with a major label. So not realistic for 99.99999% of musicians. And touring for anyone who isn't a mega artist is now a money-losing endeavor, or break even at best. So no money there. What business model would you recommend, sir? And that's where I said, you're right that most musicians will not find career success in those routes. Though I'd argue that with AI, the value of recorded music will go lower, except for what is remarkable, and the demand for live music will increase. But the way that I see musicians succeeding is by thinking outside the box, using social media, teaching, building and nurturing an email audience that you can sell directly, creating courses, collaborating, licensing. It's a portfolio style and no one size fits all. And then there was a comment about you're not really being a professional musician if you're having to teach, even a supplement. Okay, I wasn't expecting to go down that rabbit hole again and kind of relive, that threads. I wanted to sit back and offer some takeaways from that. So the one is that I realized there's just a lot of frustrated people out there that are trying to make a living doing what maybe the artists that inspired them did, artists of a previous generation. And you don't have to go that far back in time in order to find where some of these models used to work. I mean, we're not talking about 50, 60 years ago. We're talking 20 years ago, where even though there was a shift starting to take place as soon as online came around, but you go back 30 years and, you really have kind of this era where you could market yourself in a certain way. But even still, there are still some myths out there. You've never been able to just be a musician, sell yourself, and that be enough. You have to think about what kind of a person you are. Networking does matter, and marketing has always mattered. So again, this was a big tangent, but I want to talk about when to pivot, when you have to think about that. So one is, that was brought up in these replies, and that is streaming, kind of defining what a working musician is. And this is something that you have to do. You have to take an inventory of what you do well, what you can and what you're willing to improve, and what are the possibilities when you take all of that inventory, all of your skills, all of your goals. What is a way that you can package it in a way that will reach people in the places that they're looking and that will sell to people in ways that they are willing to spend their money? So when you think about streaming, for example, now just watch. Spotify Wrapped is coming. And if you have musician friends, you're going to get the usual annual rants against Spotify, talking about how low and how pitiful it is of payout, and how some artists who end up getting like 100 million streams, they end up with like $40,000, whereas they would be seeing seven figures if those were coming in album sales or whatever it is. So the musicians who are doing successful now do not put up albums on Spotify or Apple or Amazon or anywhere else for the sake of making an income. What it is it is a place that people can easily go hear your music, and it is a bit of social proof. I'm one of the millions of albums that's on Spotify. and you can direct people to that. You can put links on your website. It really serves the same purpose as any other kind of social content that you would do. Now, the difference is it is monetized and you can make some money from it, but it's probably not going to be an amount of money that will sustain you. As long as you realize that that's not the goal, that's not the purpose, you can still put your recorded music out there for streaming, and you can still, if you think you have an interested audience, you can sell them the albums directly. But the musicians who have done well currently are the ones who are not wishing that you could put this back in the box. And that is one of the key things you have to remember when it's time to pivot. Things will rarely go back to the way they were before. So you wishing things were the way that they were before is very unhealthy and counterproductive. You need to realize, like in the case of streaming, the idea of making money selling your music has become very, very hard, about as close to impossible as you can get without anything being completely impossible, and not really worth spending your energy on if that's your goal. But streaming is worthwhile if you understand what it does. So other instances that we all had to pivot. If you were a working musician 4 years ago, it was the pandemic. If you're like me, you can almost define your goals as before pandemic and since pandemic. I started my first podcast, Life in the Pit, during the pandemic. I also stopped doing as much theater. I stopped doing any theater during the pandemic, and I didn't do as much theater coming out of the pandemic. I changed a whole lot about my lesson policy and just really how I went about teaching lessons. So if you were if you got to the pandemic and you had never considered online lessons before, well, you've suddenly had to consider them. So one way to get ahead of this is just kind of to imagine, what if something like that happened again? And don't assume, it's not good to assume that it would be exactly the same thing again. But what if you have a physical place you go to do things, what if you don't have that place? So kind of thinking, what is your plan B? What is your plan C? What are some things you can work on the side so that you're not completely caught off guard if something like that happens? So a big thing that is happening right now that some of you embrace and some of you may even be panicking about, and that is AI. AI music is growing. And what this means for composers and performers is that you have to be better and more original than you were before to sell. As a performer, you have to offer something that's maybe not just you sitting down at your instrument and playing it. And this leads to the type of people that you find on Instagram, and if you're not entertained by it, you might be almost a little upset at it. Like they're doing all of these multi-skill things at one time. Like maybe they're playing guitar while they're on a unicycle and singing, or some kind of parody. A lot of people are making use of AI parodies. But if you're going to be a performer and a composer in the age of AI, you need to be thinking about the things that AI is going to have a hard time doing, such as live music. If you want to be a performer, now's the time more than any other time since maybe the invention of the long-playing record that you should consider developing a live performance career, investing in it, marketing it, and just seeing what you can do and making use of videos, making use of social media. And if you're a composer, think about how can you come up with some things that are outside the box, that are really fresh, really original, that would be very hard for AI to reproduce. Some other reasons to pivot is when you've had a new job or a schedule change. So I've gone from a piano job that basically required me to come in twice a week for a total of about 3 or 4 hours to a job as director of music at a church where I'm responsible for doing all of the playing, all of the conducting, and all of the planning. And now I've had to kind of find an extra 14, 15 hours a week to do this job well. And that is a pivot. Some of you might go from working for yourself to working at a school working at a church or, something else. And it may even go the other way around. Maybe you had a job at an institution and they had to lay people off, and maybe you were victim of that, and now you have to make money all by yourself. One reason a lot of people have to pivot has to do with health, physical health, mental health. Something happens, and you've got to address it. And it may be something major, but it may be something minor, and it just may mean that you've got to make changes to your lifestyle that may or may not affect your work, but it's definitely affecting your life, which if something affects your life, it will inevitably affect your work. So prioritizing your health, and of course the best thing, if you are healthy right now, is doing things that are prevention, being as safe as you can to avoid, disability. But, things happen. You're driving on the road. You can't control what the other person does. And, not trying to scare anybody, but things happen. And almost nobody who gets injured or has a negative health prognosis, nobody sees that coming. And it's not fun to dwell on that, but at the same time, you have to know that that's possible. It can happen to anybody, and you have to be kind of just thinking, if something happened, what would I do? Because you would have to think about it for the very first time if it does happen. I mean, you have to think about it anyway. It's better if it's not the very first time. And then the other thing that crossed my mind, this is just, I've been thinking big picture, but let's talk small picture just for one example of when to pivot, and specific to being a musician. And it's a piece that you're practicing or a piece that you're composing that's just not working. If you haven't been commissioned to do it, to play a certain piece, you don't have to. If you just are not getting into it, you can always abandon it and go with something else. And if you're composing a piece, and let's just say it is commissioned, is there a point where you have to decide, maybe I should just start over from scratch, go a completely different direction? I have done that more than once as a composer, and it's not fun when you come to that decision that you have to do it, but once you get that new direction going, it usually ends up that you end up feeling like, yes, this was the right thing to do. Okay, so we've talked about some situations where you'll probably have to pivot, and it would be just unspeakably good luck if you avoided all of those situations. So now we need to talk about how to pivot. So the first thing, let's go ahead and ask this question. When you're faced with kind of a crossroads of whether to pivot or not, go ahead and ask yourself, is this a situation where I'm choosing to pivot, or do I have a choice? If you have a choice, what are the pros and cons of staying put or doing something different? So you just need that information first. Now, if you don't have a choice, you can skip this step. But, again, like giving up a piece of music, for example, and moving on. Just take the time to realize, is this the right decision for you to make? All right, the second rule I've already said but I'll repeat it for how to pivot. You need to embrace the reality of the situation, not what you wish it was. This is what I saw all over those comments to those thread posts. A whole lot of people out there that are bitter that things aren't the way they wish they would be. And when you meet people who are successful, they are the people who have been able to shrug when confronted with reality. Maybe they really wish it was a different way. But here's how I have opportunity. Here's what I have to do. I'm going to make the most of it. In order to do that, you have to start with embracing the reality of the situation, not what you wish it was. It has nothing to do with music, but one of my regrets when it comes to physical fitness, I was really into lifting weights when I started getting into around age of 13, but really when I was 14. And, I had an injury just before I turned 16 from doing something really stupid that caused me not to be able to lift weights for a very long time. And then I never was the same after that. But before that happened, the thing that I really hate was that I could not get my own ego out of the way. I had friends or peers that would tell me that they could lift a certain amount on a bench press, for example. And I just wanted to assume badly, I wanted to badly assume that I was at least as strong as they were. And I would try to lift that weight, and I would realize, oh, I actually can't do this. I am not that strong. And so I should have swallowed my ego and just found the right weight for me and, just got used to that and then added onto that weight at a natural pace. But instead, I find myself like doing maybe a third of the range of motion with that weight or just below it. And I did not benefit myself in any way. Start doing things to kind of satisfy my ego, but I'm not growing in any way. So when we talk about reality of a situation, like maybe you're trying to decide whether or not to pivot. This is a voluntary situation, like maybe to quit a job or something like that, or do something. Can you be really honest with yourself how you are doing? Like, are you doing as well as you think you are? You have to be truly honest at self-scouting. So the third thing for how to pivot is gather information and a list of options. Just know what your possibilities are and write them down. It don't have to be things that in fact, you won't do everything you write down. That's why they're options. But you'll see what all the choices are and then start scratching off things as they occur to you, like definitely not this, and get it down to a smaller list of possibilities and maybe see if you can combine some of them if you're kind of torn between multiple choices. Once you're ready to pivot, the next thing that I would suggest is that you write your new story. Literally write it down. Take a journal or take a document online, on Microsoft Word, on Google Docs, wherever, and just write down kind of your new bio, like the bio that you would submit to someone in, say, 2 years, because this shows you where you're headed. So just think about, based on the options that you have and what you're willing to do, what is your new story now? How do you spend your time as an artist, as a musician? The fifth and the most important thing that I can offer for how to pivot, you need to define the unchangeable aspects of who you want to be and make sure that your tactics pivot to fit this overall mission for your life. Don't pivot just to pivot. So as I'm recording this, there's a book that was just released by an author I greatly admire that a lot of you have probably heard of before, Seth Godin. He has a new book about, well, I'm not sure the exact title, but the book is about strategies, about proven strategies. And I heard him on a podcast talking about, like, there's a difference between strategies and tactics. Strategy is the unchangeable, the unshakable aspect of what you want to be and who you want to serve. And your tactics are flexible. They change, they pivot. And like a good example of that is Apple. Apple has never said that they're in the business of computers. They've never said they're in the business of smartphones. They've said that they are in the business of providing easy to use technology in a way that's fun and that can be seen as a status symbol. I'm very loosely paraphrasing. But all of the decisions that they make fits that. And some things work better than others. Your companies that have been around a long time have statements that kind of define the character of what they're doing. I'll go ahead and share my unchangeable philosophy. It's creating music and developing musicians. It's that simple. I want to create music. That means I'm not, and I'm not limited to what kind of music that is and what the vehicle is. If it's film music or concert or theater, or if it's arranging other people's music, I'm willing to do that. I'm creating music no matter what. Developing musicians. It's this podcast. It's my other podcast. It's my YouTube channel. It's my private lessons. It's coaching sessions. It's small group lessons. It's working with choir and handbells at my church. It's working with a cast when I music direct a show. I am developing musicians through education of a variety of means, and I could discard any of those means or I could add new ones. So the tactics can be flexible, but your mission statement needs to be rock solid. You need to know what it is that you want to do with your life that you're not going to change. Okay, and then the final thought that I have is that if you've done that, you need to remember that pivoting is smart, successful, and healthy. It's not at all weak or defeatist. So don't ever be afraid to give up something that maybe used to give you satisfaction and it doesn't anymore, or something that you've been working on for a while and it's just not working. There is a thing called sunk cost fallacy, and that is the more time and or money you spend on doing something, the harder it is to give it up, even when faced with the evidence that it's just not being profitable for you financially or emotionally. So you have to remember this is a normal part of life, and sometimes it's exactly the right thing to do. So that's a lot of stuff, and I know I really kind of hijacked a good portion of this episode to talk about that Threads post. But to kind of just summarize everything we've gone over in this episode, there are things that are going to cause you to pivot, either by choice or by force. Things like the changing way that the marketing, that music works, whether it's streaming, whether it's the pandemic, or whether it's AI. You may have a new job, or you may have a schedule change. You may have something with your health, your physical or mental health. And there may be just a piece that you're practicing or composing and it's not working. And you have to think about completely changing how you're going about it, or start over, or do something else. And when it comes to how do you pivot, you want to first just ask yourself, do you have a choice? And if you do, what are the pros and cons of each way? You want to gather information and a list of options, and you want to always make sure that you're embracing the reality of the situation and not what you wish it was. And then when you've made a decision, write down your new story, literally writing it down. And then the most important thing is to define the unchangeable aspects of who you want to be, and make sure that your tactics pivot to fit this overall mission for your life. Don't pivot just to pivot. And finally, if you've done all that, remember that pivoting is smart, successful, and healthy, and it is not at all weak or defeatist. So that is going to wrap up episode 99. A little bit longer than I had thought it was going to be, but it's obviously something that I needed to talk about. I needed to share with you. Next week is episode 100, and I'll briefly just kind of talk about that. I'm going to talk about some moments in the podcast, but also, I would say, listen to that one all the way through, because I'm going to share what I plan to do with this podcast going forward. There will be some changes. I don't think it'll be anything negative, but it's some things that I need to share with you if you've been listening for a while. And we will talk about all of that next week on episode 100. If you need to get in touch with me, if you'd like to leave a comment in any way, you can do so with your voice at speakpipe.com/musician toolkit, or you can go to my website at davidlanemusic.com. There's a contact form right on that homepage, and feel free to share with me anything you would like, any comments based on this episode or any other episode. But that's going to do it for today. But I will be back with you again next week. Until then, thank you so much for listening.